Day to day. The sun was rising over the horizon, slowly illuminating the horizon. The day was just beginning for the railroad, an underground movement that was saving synths from slavery and destruction. The railroad had many farms and outposts across the wasteland, providing resources and keeping a watchful eye out for any danger that lurked in the shadows. The railroad had been running for over a decade now, and it had become a way of life for many of its members. Each day began with the same routine. The railroad's scouts ventured out into the wasteland, searching for any signs of trouble. Meanwhile, the farmers tended to crops, and the mechanics kept the machines in working order. At night, the railroad's members gathered in secret meetings, discussing plans for the future, and exchanging information. They often talked of the dangers they faced, from the Institute's relentless pursuit of synths to the raider gangs that roamed the wasteland. The railroad had always been a secretive organization, with its members never knowing who they could trust. But they were united in their cause, and determined to keep the railroad running. The days and weeks passed, with the railroad's members living and working for the cause. They grew stronger and more organized with each passing day, and they were beginning to see the fruits of their labor. They had saved hundreds of synths from slavery, and the railroad was growing ever stronger. But the railroad was still far from safe. The Institute and the raider gangs posed a constant threat, and the railroad's members knew that they had to remain vigilant if they were to keep the railroad running. And so it went, day after day, as the railroad's members worked hard to protect the synths and keep the railroad running. The railroad was no longer a secret, but it was still a symbol of hope and freedom for those who had faced oppression. It was a light in the darkness, and it was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was still hope. On to the missions. The sun shone brightly on the desolate wasteland, casting an eerie orange glow over the broken buildings and rubble that littered the landscape. It was a harsh reminder of the destruction that the Great War had caused, and the few that remained were determined to make the best of it. One such group of survivors were the members of the railroad, an underground movement dedicated to freeing and protecting the synths. They had heard rumors of a fault in the Institute's teleportation system, allowing some of the synths to escape. It was no surprise to them that the Institute would be so careless, and they knew that they had to intervene if they were going to save the synths. The railroad quickly assembled a team of their best agents and set out on their mission. They traveled for days, traversing the broken landscape and avoiding the countless dangers that lurked in the shadows. Eventually, they arrived at their destination, an old farming outpost that was being used as a hideout for the synths. The railroad agents quickly moved into position, surrounding the outpost and preparing for a confrontation. They knew that the Institute would not take kindly to the synths' escape, and would likely send in a team of their own to reclaim them. But the railroad were determined to protect the synths at all costs. The railroad agents waited for what seemed like an eternity, and finally, they heard the sounds of approaching footsteps. They had guessed correctly. The Institute had sent a team of their own. But the railroad was ready. The railroad agents had set up a series of traps and ambushes around the outpost, and they were more than prepared to take on the Institute. In the end, the railroad agents emerged victorious, and the synths were quickly sent away to safety. The railroad had succeeded in their mission, and the synths were safe once more. The railroad agents returned to their base, happy and relieved that the synths could now live in peace. They had done their part to protect the synths, and the railroad had grown stronger for it. The caravanners had traveled from Goodneighbor to Diamond City, trading and swapping supplies along the way. The road was long and treacherous, the ruins of the old world a constant reminder of the calamity that had befallen them. But the caravanners were a hardy bunch, and they had seen far worse in their journeys. Their destination was Bunker Hill, a fortified settlement in the heart of the Commonwealth. The caravanners had heard tales of its safety and prosperity, and they were eager to reach its gates. But the road was not without danger. The caravanners had already encountered raiders, mole rats, and ghouls. The raiders were a particularly dangerous foe, their violent tempers and disregard for human life making them a dangerous adversary. The mole rats were a nuisance, but luckily they were relatively easy to dispatch. The ghouls, however, were another matter entirely. Their numbers seemed to be increasing with every passing day, and no matter how hard the caravanners fought them, it seemed like they were never able to make a dent in their numbers. Even the most experienced caravanners were beginning to worry. Finally, after weeks of travel, the caravanners arrived in Diamond City. The sight of its towering walls filled the caravanners with a sense of relief. They were safe for now, but the danger was far from over. The caravanners took a brief respite in Diamond City, trading their wares and gathering supplies for the journey ahead. But soon enough, they were back on the road, heading towards Bunker Hill. As they drew closer to Bunker Hill, the caravanners began to see more and more signs of danger. The ruins of the old world seemed to be teeming with raiders and ghouls. The air was thick with the smell of death and decay. The caravanners did their best to stay vigilant, but they were still taken by surprise when, out of nowhere, a pack of mirrorlurks appeared. The creatures were massive and their claws and shells glinted in the moonlight. The caravanners had no choice but to fight. The battle was long and fierce, but in the end, the caravanners emerged victorious. They were battered and bruised, but they had made it through. Finally, the caravanners reached the gates of Bunker Hill. After weeks of travel, they had made it to their destination. The sight of the fortified walls brought a sense of relief and joy to the caravanners. They were safe now, and they had been able to trade and swap supplies along the way, ensuring that they would have enough to last them in their new home. The caravanners had made it, and the future looked bright. They had fought ghouls, mirrorlurks, raiders, and mole rats, and they had emerged victorious. They had seen the worst that the Commonwealth had to offer, and they were still standing. The caravanners had made it to Bunker Hill, and it was time to make a new life for themselves. The sun had only just begun to rise as Dara trudged through the streets of Goodneighbor. The slums were always the same every day, the same crumbling buildings, the same rusted signs, the same broken glass glinting in the early morning light. But despite the monotony, Dara found comfort in the familiarity, feeling a sense of belonging with each step she took. She had been living in Goodneighbor for the past 3 months, and it had already become her home. Sure, it was a far cry from the life she had known before the Great War, but it was a life filled with possibility, with a chance to make something of herself. Dara had been a scavenger before she came to Goodneighbor. She survived by scrounging for whatever she could find in the wasteland, selling it off to traders who could get the most out of it. It was a hard life, and she was used to living on the edge. But Goodneighbor was different. Goodneighbor was a place where she could feel safe. After a long day of scavenging, she could come back to the city and find shelter. She could also find work here. The city was full of traders and merchants who were willing to pay for her services. So, Dara had made it her mission to make a living here, and to help others do the same. Today, she was headed to the market, which was held in the main square of Goodneighbor. As she walked, she saw people milling about, setting up their stalls and displaying their wares. There were merchants selling weapons and armor, traders selling food and water, and even some selling junk. Dara stopped at one of the junk stalls and started going through the various items. She found a few pieces of scrap metal that could be useful, and some old clothing that could be repaired. She bartered with the seller and then made her way to the food stalls. Here, she found a few vegetables that had been salvaged from a nearby farm. She bartered with the seller for a fair price and then returned to her own stall. Dara had set up a small stall where she sold whatever she could find. It was a meager living, but it was enough to keep her going. She also used her stall as a place to help others. She would give them advice on where to find resources or how to survive in the wasteland. It was her way of giving back to the community that had taken her in. As the day went on, more and more people started to arrive in the market. Dara started to recognize some of the faces from the scavenging trips she had taken before. She even spotted a few familiar faces from her own scavenging days. After a few hours of trading, she finally had enough money to buy a few supplies for herself. She made her way to the food stall and purchased some vegetables and water. Then, she headed back to her stall and started packing up her things. The sun was beginning to set as she finished packing up. She made her way out of the market and back to her home in Goodneighbor. As she walked, she could feel the warmth of the day fading and the chill of the night air beginning to set in. Tomorrow, she would do it all again. She had made a life for herself in Goodneighbor, and she had found a sense of purpose in her day-to-day life. She had made a home here, and it was a home she would never give up. The sun burned like an unending fire in the sky, casting a hazy, orange glow over the dry, cracked earth that stretched out in every direction. It was the only world that the nomads knew, the only world that had ever existed. The nomads were a small group of survivors who had been living in a makeshift camp since the Great War had broken out. They had been traveling the wasteland for the past 5 years, scavenging what they could and trading with whatever settlements they could find. The nomads had become accustomed to their harsh environment, having to deal with the lack of food, water, and shelter. But they had also learned to adapt, using the few resources they had to maximize their comfort and safety. It had been a hard journey, but the nomads had been able to survive by relying on each other. They had kept up a steady pace, never staying in one place for too long. Today was no different. The nomads had decided to move on, in search of new opportunities. As they packed up their meager possessions, they noticed something strange in the distance. It was a group of people, walking in the same direction as the nomads. They were wearing tattered, dusty clothing and had a fierce, determined look in their eyes. The nomads stopped to take a closer look and were surprised to find that these people were also survivors of the war. They had been living in a hidden bunker deep underground, and had only recently emerged from their hideout. The two groups exchanged stories of their hardships and the nomads offered to share what little food and supplies they had. The nomads were pleased to discover that these new survivors had valuable knowledge and skills that could be useful in their travels. The new group of survivors decided to join the nomads. They had been wandering the wasteland for some time before they had encountered the nomads, and were more than happy to have some companions to travel with. The nomads welcomed the new arrivals with open arms. As they continued their journey, the nomads and the new survivors exchanged stories and advice, learning from each other. The nomads had been traveling the wasteland for years before they had found the bunker, and the new survivors were eager to learn all that they could from the nomads. The nomads in turn were happy to share their knowledge and experience, hoping to help the new survivors to survive and thrive in this harsh environment. The nomads and the new survivors continued to travel together, scavenging supplies and trading with the settlements they encountered. They formed a strong bond, relying on each other for support and protection. The nomads and the new survivors eventually found a safe haven in a small village. With the help of the nomads, the new survivors were able to rebuild their lives, finding work and establishing a home. The nomads stayed with the new survivors, helping them to become self-sufficient and to thrive in their new home. The nomads and the new survivors had found a home, and a community where they could live without fear. They had become a family, united by their shared experiences and struggles. The nomads and the new survivors had become fallout nomads. They had united in the face of adversity, and would continue to do so for generations to come. It had all started so quickly. One moment, it was just a typical day in the city, with people going about their lives. The next, it was a full-blown zombie apocalypse. I had been out running errands when it happened. I had seen the zombie hordes coming, and had managed to make it back to my apartment just in time to lock the door and block it with furniture. I had managed to survive the initial onslaught, but it was clear that I couldn't stay there for long. I had been lucky. Most of my neighbors hadn't been so fortunate and had been turned into zombies. I had to get out of the city if I was going to survive. I had grabbed a few supplies and had made my way to my car. I had been about to start the engine when I heard a strange sound coming from my radio. It was a warning. The military had detected an incoming nuclear missile, and it was heading straight for the city. I had to get out and fast. I had wasted no time and had started the engine. I had driven as fast as I could, weaving in and out of abandoned cars and zombie hordes. I had been racing against time, and every minute felt like an eternity. I had been so focused on getting out of the city that I had almost forgotten about the nuclear missile. But then I heard it. The sound of the missile as it flew overhead. I had no idea if it had hit its target or not, but I had to keep going. I had to get out before the blast radius reached me. I had kept driving and eventually, I had made it out of the city. I had pulled over to the side of the road and had just sat there, my heart pounding in my chest. I had made it. I was alive. But I knew that I couldn't stay there for long. I had to keep moving. I had to find a safe place to stay. I had to find a place to start over. So I had kept driving. I had driven for days, searching for a place to call home. Eventually, I had found a small town on the outskirts of the city. It was far enough away from the blast radius that I had felt safe to stay there. I had found a small house and had settled in. I had finally found a place to call home, and I had been able to start over. But I had never forgotten what had happened in the city. I had seen the devastation firsthand, and I had never forgotten the warning I had heard on the radio. I had been lucky to get out in time, but I knew that there were others who hadn't been so lucky. So I had dedicated my life to helping those who had been affected by the zombie apocalypse. I had done whatever I could to keep them safe and to give them a place to start over. It had taken a long time, but eventually, I had managed to build a small community of survivors. We had pooled our resources and had managed to create a safe haven for us all. We had managed to survive, and to start anew. The zombie apocalypse had been a horrific event that had changed my life forever. But I had managed to find a way to make something good come out of it. I had managed to give hope to those who had been affected by it, and I had managed to create a safe place for us all to live. The zombie apocalypse was over, but its memory would never be forgotten.